Hey folks. So, today we're going to be talking about what I would argue is one of the most important elements of games development, and is often the most overlooked by students and even people in industry. Um, this is the role of UI and UX in your projects. Um, let's jump right into a hypothetical. Um, let's say that you and your friends are going out for a meal, and you're trying to decide whereabouts to go. And you spot this pub, it catches your eye. It's got quite a nice brand on the outside, kind of looks quite classy. Looks like some kind of exclusive club. Piques your interest, and as you approach, you get this kind of like waft of kind of delicious, vivid smells from the extractor fan that you know draws you in closer, and you go behind the door to check it out, and this is what you see inside. um, and you wait for a couple of minutes. There doesn't appear to be any staff around, and just as you're about to leave, someone turns up, takes you to a table, and shows you this. Uh, so, what's the point of this? Um, the takeaway from this, no pun intended, is that the quality of the food, no matter how good it was, it might be incredibly tasty food. Um, the experience of the consumer and the customer up till that point um, was compromised because of like that compromised them actually getting to the meal. They never reached that point um, because of your bad UI and bad UX in that environment. And in games, this is like exponentially more important. Your app will 100%. Uh, okay, remember, no absolutes. But like the majority of apps live and die on their UI and UX. It's very, very important as part of development. So let's kind of go to the foundations. Like, what is UI? So most of you, I assume, would know what UI is. It's a pretty well-known term. It's kind of a term known outside of games, um, and yeah, it's basically like the interface that you interact with. Often, this is like simplifying the complex systems. If you look back to the very first UIs, these were like a means of simplifying, programming terminals. Um, in games themselves, you're looking at things like game over screens, start menus, pause screens, things like that, and even elements, things like health bars or uh, points, things like that. UX is something a little bit more interesting. So UX is stands for user experience. So this is less about how the game looks and more about how your player navigates and interacts with your experience and how you can kind of influence that path through the project. So um, and as with the example that I gave before, um, this isn't exclusive to games. If there's lots of kind of subliminal systems that exist out there, um, that can be used to kind of influence people. Um, a great example of kind of invisible UX in the public world. There's a thing called perception of access, I believe it's called, which is basically where like uh, I'm sure you'll have experienced this if you're in like a shopping center and there's or let's say the cinema, and everyone's leaving the cinema. People will wait by the automatic doors to leave the cinema, and there will be like multiple sets of like doors that you can push either side, and people will choose to wait by the automated door to leave, because that's perceived as the easiest way out. Um, so like an example applied to games in a similar vein to that is in Half Life. Uh, the way that the game kind of tells you that you're unable to go in certain doors is they won't have door handles on the doors. It's just just the door handle's been knocked off. So yeah, like you get this kind of crossover between real world and video game related examples. You can see on the left hand side here, the example I've got in Corporate Salmon is on the first playthrough you just have one button to press, and then on the second playthrough or repeat playthroughs you then get these other elements creeping in once you've completed the tutorial sections. Um, these are kind of elements that kind of quite often interact with one another. One of the easiest ways to control the UX, how the player navigates through the game is with the UI, as you saw by that example on the other page. And yeah, both of them are really, really important. So what I'm going to do at this point is I'm going to give you like a run through of one of my games, the process of developing the UI and kind of iterating it over quite an extended period of time. And yeah, just kind of like showing how like these elements evolved over the course of development. So let's start out at the very, very, very beginning. So this is like the kind of trashy. This was like I think 2010, I believe it was, when I was in first year at university. This was a project I built in X and A. Yeah, and we were basically given the assignment to modify a version of Breakout. Um, for any of you that don't know what Breakout is, it's basically um, it's a game where you bounce the ball around. You're kind of a paddle, and you destroy bricks. The variant that I made on it is that you have, as you can just about see here, there's the ball, which let me see if I can up the quality a little bit on that. Yeah, so you've got the ball kind of bouncing around the environment, and unlike the kind of traditional Breakout where the paddle is at the bottom and the bricks are at the top, you are an alien spaceship and you're kind of destroying a city, and then abducting the little humans that pop out of the buildings. And you can see from this version of it that there's like, there's some elements that are quite good, but there's a lot that is kind of pretty bad with it. So, in terms of good stuff, you've got a nice kind of bit of contrast there where you've got the very bright background against kind of black bricks, which kind of stand out quite well. The less kind of good bits is that the player is like ridiculously small. It's kind of nearly impossible to see the player, and that makes it really, really hard to hit the ball. Arguably the paddle should probably have been about the size of those shields at the back. Yeah, there's a lot of kind of bad information on the top. These things could be presented in nice ways in game, but it's all quite crammed in and not very interesting to look at. So yeah, there's like clearly a lot of different things that need improving about the project. So yeah, let's kind of quickly move on to the next iteration. So this was kind of like um, the first time that this was when I'd started using the program Stencil and I was still kind of getting to grips with games development. So you can kind of clearly see in this version that there's still things aren't quite right. And if in some ways we've taken a step backwards. So I've still got the bright background in here, but I've got more um, kind of high opacity elements in the foreground. So I've got these, skyscrapers here, which are almost indistinguishable from the foreground. And then, the players are a lot easier to see now, which is good. But like, you've got kind of the black UI, you've got the black spaceship, you've got there's too much, there's not enough contrast. And then there's also too much contrast at the same time. And then you've got these clouds whizzing through, which are just completely distracting. And yeah, even more kind of information being displayed on screen and in just like the most ugly possible way. Having said that, I've increased the size of the paddle. The ball is bigger, and the civilians do happen to stand out very, very well in this environment. So there were things that were learned. So let's kind of move on from here. So I did, as part of kind of experimenting with this, I kind of got a mobile port of this working. Um, so as part of that, I took it from desktop to mobile, um, and kind of got rid of the arrow keys and went for like a nice kind of nifty one-handed swipe left and right, kind of matching the position of the thumb. Um, and as a means of activating the beam, I had it that um, you had a button at the bottom that you kind of brought your thumb down into to activate the beam, which was quite cathartic. Um, there were some elements that I added which were kind of weird. So you can see that I got this kind of scaling background thing to indicate the progress of the player that wasn't very clear. Um, the kind of ball was moving so fast and had like the particles kind of being so small. Sorry, being so similar to the size of the ball, it actually made it quite hard to read what was going on. One thing that I did add, which was I thought was a really really nice touch, um, was I made it so if you kind of smacked the side of the ball as it was flying upwards, so if you were like as the player like going at a certain speed, you could actually kind of like hit it like a puck. You can see on this screen here as this GIF loops, me doing it. Here we go. So you get all the particles, and yeah, that was like a really satisfying addition. So there was lots of kind of uh, nice new elements that I'd added, but there's still like quite a bit of work to do. So the project kind of sat for a little bit longer. I basically um, I kind of worked on this project in between working on Narcissus and Corporate Salmon, and realized that this project was too big for me to kind of develop at the time. So I picked it up again after experimenting on it a bit further. I overhauled the palette. Things were, if you look at the previous one, whoops, wrong way. Uh, it it was it was an improvement on this, but it was also kind of not a particularly cohesive palette. And I wanted to keep things as simple as possible, so I baked the color palette down further to make it very clear and clean. Um, I changed the ball trail so it was kind of easier to read. That it was a single entity almost, and shape being kind of passed around. Um, I updated all the menus to make them cleaner, and I actually kind of tried to keep them cohesive with the rest of my games, rather than having something completely out there and too radically different. Um, yeah, and I got rid of that. I got rid of that kind of weird background scaly thing, but I did add like a ball tracker, which kind of let you know at the bottom of the screen where the ball was, and then kind of scaled and shrunk based on how close to the ground it was, which in reality was kind of like a weird artifact that players didn't really notice, and it didn't really it didn't really mean anything. It was kind of a silly addition. You can see as one good improvement is that I've altered the score on screen down to nearly nothing. So it's three things. So it's the stage that you're on, your score, and then your high score. So a bit different from this. Um, so yeah, then I took things a little bit further and kind of focused a little bit more on like the UI element, so UX side of things. So you can see when I abduct one of uh, the humans, you'll see that there's a little pop, kind of a little sphere that appears when they hit the beam, uh, which is great. Um, I experimented with slowing down the ball when the player activated the beam, as a means of uh, kind of giving the player a little bit more of a chance to abduct the players, but the enemies, but still having a little bit of danger, to not make them complacent. Um, yeah, in terms of simplifying the UI, I still wanted there to be a sense of progress for the player, so I added a percentage bar. So, if you manage to capture all of the civilians in the time period, you would be awarded. Um, Now, one of the problems that I'd come across whilst playtesting, and once again, this shows like why it's so important to playtest, so, regularly, is that for a lot of people, it was the height of the button was was too low for people to reach. Like it was really far down the screen, so it was a strain for people to reach. Um, and on top of that as well, uh, players were constantly holding down the beam button because they thought they could, and what I had in place was that it was almost using your fuel. So over time, it would sink, and players would just basically like crash themselves into the ground without even realizing that they were losing. Um, so yeah, there were definitely still some things for me to try and fix and work out. Um, and this kind of continues on, trying to fix that problem. I decided that the button solution of having the button on screen, you can see from this little cursor that I added for testing, where my thumb is throughout the game. Um, and I just decided that it was easier to have a release and what's the word, like tie the beam being active to whether you were touching the screen or not, and then that way it reduced the amount of kind of upwards and downwards movement that you had to worry about as a player. Um, I realized as well that like the positioning of the percentage bar, this place here is where the person's thumb is. So you wouldn't see this percentage bar. Um, and I saw this in playtesting. So like most players didn't even notice it there. So I moved it up. I moved it to here. So the player would kind of see it right above their thumb. You can see as well, I've nudged these down a little bit further to make them a little bit more central. Um, yeah, and one of the other kind of really important things I did is I replaced the button with a slider. So something that a little bit more familiar. So like what you'd have on a browser, having like a bar that would slide, to kind of move between windows. Uh, and probably one of the most um, kind of important changes I made is the color of the player. So in terms of the color on the map, um, there is elements of red, but they're kind of blended with other stuff, and it's quite limited. So what I did was I made the player like very very intense colors for what are usually just the accents in the level. So you can see that I've got this very very bright red. I've got the white of the glass, and then the bright green for the alien and the beam. So all of the kind of important elements are kind of highlighted in green, red, or white, and then everything else is kind of like blended into the background. Yeah, so like these were kind of changes that definitely helped get the readability of the game. Ironically, because in the previous versions, people thought that this was the enemy. They thought that they didn't know where the player was in the game. They didn't realize that they were the spaceship, because usually the kind of traditional position in games for the enemy is at the top of the screen. Um, so yeah, having the enemy being so bright and clear, sorry, having the player being so bright and clear was a means of highlighting, that this is who the player is inhabiting. Um, One kind of problem that did come up was the kind of the slowdown thing I had. You can see it here, where when you let go and you kind of abduct, civilians, uh, it did make the actual predicting the slow down and speed up function much much harder, because you could get stuck in a position where you had to touch the screen um, to move the player into position to catch the ball, but gauging the ball at the previous speed and the current speed meant that like the ball would often get past you very easily. Um, so from there, I kind of made some further adjustments. So I realized that on bigger screens, people were struggling. Whoops, people were struggling. Uh, sorry, I'm trying to operate this with a scroll wheel. So like the UI, the way it was set up here, is it would scale based on the device size. So if you were playing this on a tablet, you had to like proper drag the slider all the way across the screen. Um, so what I did instead with this is I halved the slider. So, you know, moving it half the distance would cover, double the space. And this kind of, kind of left the player with still, pretty good control, but a lot more nippy in terms of you know, uh, needing to move around the space. Um, Another element coming back all the way to the start, which only kind of became more prominent as I've gone on. I increased the size of the ball. So this is where it was at the beginning, and then this is where it was, at this point. So it was much easier for the player to hit it, and just a lot cleaner to read. It also meant that like when players were viewing this on the App Store, that they, the what was going on, like it was very clear that the ball was like the focal point and the interesting element of the game. Another thing that I did was for there were certain players that had never played Breakout before and they didn't understand the danger of being on the top of the screen. So what I did is rather than making it so when the ball went off screen you lost, I made it that there was this kind of bar here, this death bar that if you hit you lost. So it was very clear to the player when it hit that surface that the game was lost. Um, at this point, I completely scrapped the score system and just went with a percentage bar. So the number of humans you successfully abducted was your score, and you had a rating system as part of that. Yeah. So you can see at this point it's really starting to become like a cohesive project. Um, yeah. I was really really chuffed with how this was kind of coming together. The only thing at this point is you can see the ball is still only moving in diagonals. And yeah, this kind of made it a little bit hard to control and quite difficult to predict where the ball would specifically go. Um, and yeah, then from here, this was kind of on the final run up to release. There was still like a lot of different elements that I kind of got implemented, towards the end of the project. So you can see up here, I changed the percentage bar to include these little stars that as you reach certain threshold points, you would get a star that would appear. So if you hit like, I don't know, 20%, you got like your first star, 40%, your second, etc., etc. Um, yeah, like there was so many like I could spend so much time talking about this project because there were just so many like what I've kind of described to you is just like the for the most part the movement mechanics, but there was just so many like little systems that I designed as part of this project which were just so fascinating to experiment with. Um, One of these was like figuring out how to fix one of the common problems of Breakout, which is getting stuck with one brick that you've got to kind of get, and you can't get the angle quite right. So what I did was just kind of was use this as an opportunity for some spectacle. So when you destroyed the second to last brick, it would then turn the ball into this missile that would, kind of homing missile into the last brick and just completely destroy it. Um, and yeah, that just gave you a couple of seconds to just hoover up, the last few humans you had on the map, and just appreciate that you'd smashed the mission, which was really good. And then after that point, I made it so you had like a countdown of like 3 seconds to clear up any other debris in the level, and any more kind of humans in the level. Yeah, previously I'd tried to kind of implement that as a system where you could bail early on the level by like tapping the top of the screen, and it just complicated things. So like, simplifying these systems, keeping it nice and clean, giving you the nice message once you destroyed the city. Yeah, just tried to keep the UI nice and simple. Um, yeah, and then the other element was I kind of got a whole shop system built in there, so you can see that like after each mission, you've got the option to go and dump your humans in a vat to then upgrade your spaceship, and then you had these different power ups that you kind of upgraded the thresholds for. Yeah, which kind of got some pretty good engagement with and felt very satisfying to use. Um, with the actual that with that UI element, it had a very kind of satisfying noise when you dumped humans in the actual uh, in the vat, which as it was upgrading and kind of cycling through upgrades. Um, yeah, uh, that it was a lot. I really enjoy designing shop systems, and in general, like I love UI. I used to hate UI. It's one of my favorite things to design in games now. On reflection, um, despite all of the effort and meticulous iteration that I put into the project, there is definitely a question that plagues me, which is as if you've watched the previous lecture about my career in games, uh, you know I had an issue with people not understanding the tutorial, or rather dropping off before they reach the main gameplay. And I do wonder that if we go back, oh nope, wrong way, wrong way, wrong way. Yeah, if we go back to the first kind of iterations of the project with arrow keys left and right, I have to ask, would this have been a simpler approach to just have the beam constantly active, uh, and then just have arrow keys left and right? Or in the case of the touch screen, touch one side of the screen to go left, touch one side of the screen to go right. It would have been a lot easier to explain. It might not have been as sophisticated or given the player as much control as I'd have liked, but it would have meant I'd have had to do less tutorializing, and it would have it would have potentially meant higher engagement with the game. Going back to that original question of if you lose people before, uh, if you lose people at this point, they never get to experience your product. So that is also worth thinking about. So these weren't necessarily the best decisions, but you can see the path on which the game kind of advanced. Um, so going into like what you're going to be doing, um, and what you should be, in terms of what I like to do when I design UIs for projects. One of my main kind of one of my main mantras when it comes to designing UI is is to get it on your phone and visible on a device as soon as physically possible. UI is one of those things that a lot of students leave till last minute. They just kind of like throw it together as something that they don't consider very important. And it's really frustrating because again, it's the first thing that your players will see. So what I like to do is I get my notepads. I'll sketch up a bunch of kind of UI layouts. I'll photograph them, and then I'll check them on my phone. I'll check the scaling of buttons. Yeah, make sure it looks cohesive. Test thumb placements, see if I can reach areas easily. Yeah, and kind of scope out the functionality, even though I'm just dealing with photos. It might feel kind of weird to do, but it can make a big difference in exposing kind of flaws with the UI before you have to mock up assets. Um, yeah, so what I just want you to do, you can pause the video now. We will be covering this in class, so you may have already done this by this point. Um, but, take the next minutes to think about your UI for your game. Uh, Doodle out some basic drawings of your UI and photograph them on your phones and kind of crop it to match the screen and see how it feels. Um, yeah, I'll let you do that now. Obviously, this video will keep going, but just pause it and do that. So now that you've had a little experiment with that, something that I kind of covered in previous lecture, but I just wanted to kind of reinforce again. These are some of my student UI UX pet peeves and things I don't want to see in your projects. So the first one uh, is I do not want to see this background or this color background. So, uh, you know, if you're trying to be professional about your projects, and in particular, if you're wanting to kind of give a good first impression, your menu, like I wouldn't, most of you don't bother having this in gameplay, but so many students will have this background and then one button in the middle saying start, and it's just like the easiest way to indicate to an employer that you are, you know, not taking this seriously and don't have any understanding of like, you know, UX and UI as an experience for customers. Um, same for Unity buttons. Um, it's just a really basic thing to update these buttons. With either place your own graphics or just customizing them in a way to not make them look generic as hell. Yeah, as kind of I showed you through before, don't just do the first UI and stick with it. It's very, very easy, as with games development in general, to do your own tutorials and do them to death, and not realize that your bias against your own projects, and essentially blind to how difficult they could be. Um, you know, test as often as you physically can. With Morse, what I'm working on at the moment, for example, I've had to constantly test with that project because not only am I competent in Morse code now, I also know the tutorial inside out and the gameplay sequences. So it's really really it's too easy for me to play the games, and when I test it with new people, I realize that I've been basing it too much on my own experience. Um, when it comes to UI, I can't really think of a project that I haven't done multiple iterations of UI on. Yeah, yeah, it's just one of those things that, like, if you're just settling for the first UI, you've probably not put enough time into it. These things really take time to iterate, and you should be seeing how players react to it, not just with your gameplay sequence. Because customers are really fickle. If they have a crap initial experience, they'll abandon your project at a heartbeat. Um, yeah, and as I said before, this is kind of taking that sketch concept, forwards a little bit. Um, Test your games and your UI on devices as soon as physically possible. Um, do it when you've just still got mock-ups. You don't need to have gameplay or a functional game to start testing these things on devices. Um, for my game Chess Run, you can see here that when I tested this on my phone, I have quite a small phone. I much prefer having a small phone. I get terrified by like larger iPhones and larger devices in general. I'm convinced I'll drop them. But you can see by the size of this phone here, that like the player, when I initially put the mock-ups for this game on the phone, the player is like ridiculously small, um, and you can't quite see what's going on. So I made some adjustments to kind of address that. I made the player, I think it was twice or three times as big. Um, and the other thing as well, as part of that, actually no, I've just made a mistake. That isn't the player, that's the king. The player is so small that I didn't even see them on this. So yeah, that kind of gives you an idea of like how unnoticeable the player the player was on this original layout. You can see that they're a little bit clearer here, but it's still not 100%. Yeah, but you can see why it's so important to test this stuff. And you can see, again, like where my thumb is, you can see that I can just about reach those buttons, but it's important to play test that stuff early to make sure it feels good. Um, Continuing on what I've just talked about, um, you might have heard of this term before. It's called ergonomics, which is basically like, going back to what I was talking about before in terms of like ease of access and building stuff that is the kind of lowest path of resistance uh, for UI elements. A great example of this from my own work with Narcissus um, was what the original UI looked like. I wanted, with like a lot of arcade games, for the start game button to be at the top. If you think about where your thumb is down here, that is a ridiculous stretch to get to that start game button. And also, with the button being in black, it kind of blends into the background a little bit more compared to these settings menu elements, which are in white. Um, so yeah, what I did was, um, I flipped this over. So the start game button was like the easiest to access button, and made set it in white. So it was very very easy to access. Um, Make sure that when you're designing your UI that um, factor in different device scales. So make sure, as we went over last week, that you anchor your UI elements to the correct positions on screen, um, and that potentially even set limits to kind of where those elements can be stretched to. On like really wide devices, you might find it that those buttons are ridiculously spaced apart. Potentially have like a midpoint or kind of set limits to your canvases to how big you want them to get. Um, yeah, and as a kind of swoop, and as I said before, as I covered, make sure that your UI, your thumb, isn't blocking any of your UI. So, for example, in corporate salmon before, I had UI information down here, and the player thumb kind of blocked it. This was kind of okay. There was enough space here that it wasn't too obstructive, having the thumb there. Um, and as part of it, I had different elements of UI scattered around the screen. Um, One thing I don't want to see in any of your projects is a how to play screen. You can have it in there, but you should not be relying on it for teaching your player what to do. Um, a, the thing that you should be using to teach your player is a tutorial. Um, there's no excuse for just having a how to play screen. It's quite exclusionary because it basically means the only people that are going to understand how to play a game are people that can speak English. If you can show it in gameplay, and have indicators that kind of transcend language, uh, that's going to translate a lot better into engagement than if you just have this only on screen or just a giant wall of text that you've got to read through. Um, yeah, and as part of that as well, make sure that you split that tutorial up into bits that are kind of easier to process. So with corporate salmon, for example, it it lets you get used to jumping initially. It gives you the prompt to tap the screen to jump. Uh, then after that, have coins introduced. Then after that, you have once you've collected a coin, you then have enemies introduced. Then once you've managed to dodge some enemies, you then have power ups introduced. And then once you've collected power ups, you then have kind of the profit lines introduced. And then only when you get to the next level do you get the loss lines introduced on top of that as well, which are kind of like the negative elements to kind of add a bit more challenge. And each of those things was separated up and were kind of dependent on you completing a certain segment before the next set would trigger. And what was great with that as well is once you'd completed that threshold, it didn't go back to the start. It just carried you on from where you were. A really easy way to do this in your own games is to just have a variable. So just have like a variable called tutorial stages. I use this for pretty much all my projects. Once the player has passed a certain stage in the tutorial, they should not repeat doing it again. Having it be a completed thing, and then you're kind of getting them started from the stage in the tutorial from where they failed before. That repetition on those tutorial elements, particularly if they restrict features, will put players off in time if you're not careful. Um, yeah, so obviously we've covered quite a lot of stuff. In terms of what I want you to be doing for next week, mock up your mock-ups. So the paper mock-ups that you've created in the time that you've been watching this, uh, you know, get those blocked out in either Unity, or preferably just do them in something like Paint. Not Paint, but if you can get access to something better like Photoshop, or AE Sprite. Sorry, not AE Sprite, ASE Sprite. I don't know how to pronounce it. It's rubbish naming, but a great tool. Um, but yeah, digitally mock up your UIs. Uh, you know, if you haven't already, experiment with uh, laying out your UI in Canvas. Experiment with the Text Mesh Pro elements if you haven't already. Um, and yeah, if you've got any UI elements in your games, think about contrast, think about ergonomics, think about all these elements that I've discussed in the game, and we will be going over it later. But start to think about how you're going to articulate the mechanics of the game to the player. We will be doing a session on tutorial stuff down the line, but for now, just try and make something that's as approachable as possible. Cool. So yeah, if you have any questions, just let us know. Um, and otherwise, I look forward to seeing what UIs you create. Cool.